My stepdad raised his glass, looked me dead in the eye, and said, Asterisk, you'll never be half the man my son is. Asterisk. Everyone laughed. Even him. So I stood up, smiled, and said, Asterisk, good. Because 3 months from now, he's going to need me. Asterisk. They laughed harder. But exactly 92 days later, there was a knock on my door. And when I opened it, his perfect son was standing there, begging. My name is Celeste. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. The dinner table was full and loud the way it always was when my stepdad, Franklin, was in a good mood. Glasses raised, voices overlapping, the warm smell of food filling the room. I was reaching for the bread basket when he tapped his glass and the table quieted. He looked directly at me, smiling the way he smiled when he was about to say something he had already decided was funny. You know what your problem is, he said. You'll never be half the man my son is. Laughter moved around the table like a wave. My stepbrother, Preston, grinned into his glass. My mother looked at her plate. I sat very still for a moment. Then I set down the bread, looked at Franklin calmly, and said, Good. Because 3 months from now, he's going to need me. The laughter got louder. I let it. That night, lying in bed listening to the house settle into quiet, I let myself look at the full picture for the first time in a long while. It hadn't always been this sharp. When Franklin married my mother 9 years ago, the comparisons had been small, offhand remarks, gentle redirections toward Preston as the example I should follow. Preston got better grades, Franklin would say. Preston knew how to present himself. Preston understood what it meant to be ambitious. I was 16 then, and I had believed, for a few years, that if I worked hard enough the comparisons would stop. They never stopped. They had simply become louder and more comfortable, the way habits do when nobody challenges them. Franklin had compared me to Preston so many times and for so long that it had stopped feeling like criticism and started feeling like fact, at least to everyone at that table. Everyone except me. Later that same night, after the dishes were done and the guests had gone, I walked past the living room and heard them. Franklin and Preston, voices low but carrying through the half-open door. Preston said, She wouldn't survive a week in the real world. She never had to, we've always carried her. Franklin laughed. A short, satisfied sound. I stood in the hallway and breathed slowly through my nose the way I had taught myself to do in moments when anger wanted to make decisions for me. We've always carried her. The irony of that sentence was so complete it almost made me want to walk through that door and lay out exactly what carrying them had looked like for the past 4 years. The emergency car repair I had covered quietly. The household bills during the 3 months Franklin's business hit a rough patch. The loan I had never asked to be repaid. I didn't walk through the door. I went to my room and opened my laptop instead. I started with a spreadsheet. Every financial contribution I had made to the household over the past 4 years, dated and documented as best I could from my own bank records and memory. The bill payments. The emergency funds. The grocery runs during the months when money was tighter than Franklin wanted to admit publicly. It came to more than I had realized when it was all in one place. I wasn't doing this to build a case or to confront anyone. I was doing it because I had spent years operating from a position of invisibility, making things work quietly, asking for nothing, staying out of the spotlight that Franklin kept trained permanently on Preston. That invisibility had protected me in some ways. But it had also let them build a story about me that had no basis in reality. I was done being invisible on their terms. I was going to become very visible, just somewhere else entirely. The spreadsheet took 2 evenings to complete. When it was done, I sat back and looked at the numbers for a long time. 4 years of quiet contributions. Rent covered during 2 separate months when Franklin's business account ran short and he told my mother not to worry, he'd handle it, and then didn't, and I stepped in without being asked and without saying a word about it afterward. The refrigerator that broke in January 2 years ago. Replaced on my card. The property tax shortfall that Preston was supposed to cover from his share of a joint account and didn't, which I had quietly resolved so my mother wouldn't have to deal with the stress. None of it was dramatic. None of it had come with an announcement. That was exactly the problem. I had kept things running the way a foundation keeps a building standing, invisibly, completely, taken entirely for granted by everyone living comfortably above it. It was time to build something of my own. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the dinner. It was Kwame, an old colleague from my previous role in operations management, someone I had worked closely with for 2 years before he moved into independent consulting. He asked if I was still in the field, still sharp, still interested in a challenge. I told him yes to all three. He explained the situation plainly. A mid-sized logistics company called Meridian Freight was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that made headlines, the quiet kind, where systems had been poorly managed for long enough that the whole structure was starting to strain. They needed someone to come in, assess the damage, and build a path forward. It was contract work. No guarantees beyond the initial engagement. The hours would be long and the problems would be genuinely difficult. Kwame said, "I recommended you specifically. They trust my judgment. But I need to know you're all in." I looked at my spreadsheet still open on my laptop. "I'm in," I said. My first week at Meridian Freight was the hardest. The operations had more problems than the initial briefing had suggested. Routing inefficiencies layered on top of vendor contract issues layered on top of a staff morale problem that had been quietly building for 18 months. The previous consultant had identified the symptoms without addressing the causes, which had made things marginally worse. I started at the beginning. Mapped every process. Talked to the people on the ground. The dispatchers, the warehouse leads, the drivers who actually understood where the friction was. I listened more than I spoke in those first days, which seemed to surprise people who had been talked at by management for a long time. By the end of the second week, I had a clear picture and a structured plan. The director, a steady woman named Ms. Okonkwo, reviewed my assessment and said, "This is exactly what we needed. How soon can you start implementing?" For the first time in a long time, someone was asking me what I could do, not telling me what I couldn't. Preston's success had always been performed more than built. I had understood this for years but had never fully examined it. He was charming in rooms where charm was the primary currency, good at first impressions, good at networking events, good at the kind of confident small talk that made people feel like they were in the presence of someone substantial. But I had watched him up close for 9 years. I had seen the ventures that launched loudly and dissolved quietly, the business partnership that lasted 7 months before the other party walked away. The import deal he had described at 2 separate family dinners as a major breakthrough, which I later discovered had returned about a third of what he had projected. Franklin knew about some of these. He contextualized them as learning experiences, stepping stones, evidence of ambition, rather than outcomes worth examining. The network that kept Preston afloat wasn't his own. It was Franklin's, built over decades and lent to Preston like a borrowed coat he had come to believe was his own. That coat, I was beginning to understand, had limits. 3 months passed. At Meridian Freight, the changes had taken hold in the ways that mattered most. Quietly, structurally, in the daily operations that determined whether a company was actually healthy or just appearing to be. Vendor relationships had been renegotiated. Routing efficiency was up. Staff turnover, which had been a silent drain on the company's capacity, had slowed significantly because people finally felt like the problems they had been reporting were actually being addressed. Ms. Okonkwo offered me a permanent leadership role at the end of the second month. I accepted at the end of the third, once I was certain the foundation was solid enough to build on. At home, nothing had changed. Franklin still held court at the dinner table. Preston still arrived to Sunday meals with the energy of someone who had just come from somewhere important. Nobody asked about my work. I didn't offer. I was content, for the moment, to let them keep the story they had decided was true. The first sign that something was wrong came through my mother. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying that particular careful quality it got when she was trying to discuss something difficult without fully committing to discussing it. She said Franklin seemed stressed, that he had been short-tempered lately, that some of his business relationships seemed to be shifting in ways she didn't fully understand. I asked a few gentle questions and listened carefully to her answers. What emerged, pieced together from what she knew and what she didn't realize she was telling me, was a picture of a business under real strain. Franklin's company, a mid-sized import and distribution operation he had built over 20 years, had made several significant investments over the past 18 months, most of them connected in some way to ventures Preston had recommended or been involved with. The investments had not performed, and the strain was no longer quiet. Franklin's response to difficulty had always been to expand outward rather than look inward. When his company had hit rough patches in the past, he had managed them by doubling down, new partnerships, new projects, new narratives about why the current moment was actually the beginning of something bigger. It was a strategy that had worked for him often enough that it had become his default. But it required the right conditions. A network willing to extend credit on goodwill, a reputation intact enough to open doors, and a strong enough foundation to absorb the momentum of doubling down. None of those conditions were currently in place. His network was shifting because Preston's reputation, which had borrowed so heavily from Franklin's, was beginning to affect Franklin's own standing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The goodwill was thinning. The doors were slower to open. And Franklin, characteristically, was attributing every symptom to external causes, the economic climate, unfair competitors, bad timing, without once looking at the decisions that had created the conditions. I found out by accident. Ms. Okonkwo called me into her office to review a list of outstanding creditor relationships, companies that Meridian Freight had significant financial ties to and that needed to be carefully managed as we continued restructuring. It was routine work, the kind of review I did regularly. I was halfway down the list when I saw the name. Franklin's company, listed as a creditor, owed a substantial sum by a subsidiary of Meridian Freight that had been poorly managed before I arrived. The debt was real, documented, and part of the broader financial restructuring I had been overseeing for 3 months. I read the line twice. Then I set the paper down and looked out Ms. Okonkwo's window for a moment. The company I had spent 3 months stabilizing, the one that was now on solid ground because of decisions I had made and implemented, was one of the key financial relationships that Franklin's business depended on to survive its current crisis. He had no idea I was involved. Neither did Preston. I said nothing. Not to Ms. Okonkwo, there was no reason to, since my professional relationship with Meridian Freight was entirely separate from my personal history with Franklin. Not to my mother. Not to anyone. I simply went back to my desk and continued working. But I was aware, in a way I hadn't been before, of the exact shape of the situation. Franklin's business needed the creditor relationship with Meridian Freight to remain stable and cooperative during his restructuring. Meridian Freight's approach to that relationship was now, in practical terms, influenced significantly by me. I had not sought this position. I had not engineered it. I had simply done my job thoroughly and followed an opportunity that had come to me on its own merits. But the position existed nonetheless. And I understood, sitting at my desk with the creditor list in front of me, that I was not going to use it as a weapon. I was going to use it, if it came to that, as a mirror. Preston started making calls. I heard this secondhand, through Kwame, who moved in overlapping professional circles and mentioned it casually during one of our check-ins. Preston had been reaching out to contacts across the logistics and distribution network, looking for someone who could help negotiate the creditor situation his father's business had landed in. The calls were not going well. The reputation Preston had spent years building on borrowed goodwill was proving less durable than he had believed. People who had taken his calls enthusiastically 18 months ago were now slower to respond. Some weren't responding at all. Kwame said, without knowing the full picture, he's finding out that a network built on someone else's name doesn't hold when that name starts to wobble. I nodded and said nothing about my connection to any of it. But I thought about Preston at that dinner table, grinning into his glass while Franklin made his toast. He was finding out what the real world looked like when the connections ran dry. Word traveled the way it always does in professional communities, not through announcements but through the gradual shift in how people spoke about someone. Preston had been spoken about for years as Franklin's son, the implication being that Franklin's reputation was a context that made Preston's own ventures more credible. It was a kind of borrowed light, and it had worked for a long time. But borrowed light only reaches so far. When Franklin's own standing began to soften in the community, when the investments connected to Preston's advice started showing their real returns, when the conversations in offices and over lunches started carrying a different tone, the borrowed light dimmed. People who had done business with Preston on the strength of Franklin's name began to reassess. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just in the quiet practical ways that matter most. Slower responses, shorter meetings, fewer referrals. Preston's name, detached from Franklin's, was not yet strong enough to stand on its own. He was learning this in real time, one unreturned call at a time. I saw Franklin at Sunday dinner the week before everything shifted. He looked different. Not dramatically. He was still composed, still held himself with the particular uprightness of a man who had built something and wanted people to know it. But there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been as deep a few months ago. A tightness in his jaw that he was working to keep out of his voice. He asked Preston, across the table, about the creditor situation. Quietly, carefully, as if the other people at the table wouldn't notice if the question was phrased casually enough. Preston said they were working through it. Franklin nodded slowly. I watched his face. For the first time in 9 years of Sunday dinners and family gatherings and toasts where his son's name was raised and mine was used as a counterpoint, for the first time in all of that, I saw something in Franklin's expression that I had never seen there before. Fear. Not of me. Not yet. Just fear, plain and unguarded, sitting on his face for one unprotected moment before he rearranged it. Preston brought up my name himself. Kwame told me this later, having heard it from someone who had been in the room, a mutual contact who knew both Preston and me and had apparently found the moment significant enough to mention. Preston had been in a meeting with 2 of Franklin's senior advisors, going through options for the creditor situation. Someone had mentioned Meridian Freight specifically. The restructuring, the new leadership, the more cooperative stance the company seemed to be taking under new management. Preston had said, almost thinking aloud, I wonder if there's someone we could approach there. Someone who might be able to help move this along. And then, after a pause, he had said my name. Franklin had reportedly shut it down immediately. Said it wasn't necessary. Said they would find another way. His pride had reflexively rejected the idea before he had even properly considered it. But the name had been said. And once said, it didn't go away. The bills were not theoretical. Franklin's business had real obligations, suppliers, employees, lease agreements, that did not pause while he managed his pride. The creditor situation with Meridian Freight was one piece of a larger financial pressure that was becoming harder to manage quietly. 2 of his longest-serving employees came close to resigning that month. His operations manager, a man named Clement who had been with Franklin for 11 years, called in a favor and got an honest conversation with someone in Franklin's network who told him plainly that the situation was more serious than Franklin was letting on internally. Clement, according to my mother who had heard fragments through Franklin, had gone to Franklin directly and said the staff needed to see a clear plan or they would start looking for stability elsewhere. Franklin didn't have a clear plan. For the first time, the machinery that had always kept his world running smoothly was showing him its limits, and the option he had dismissed out of pride was becoming, quietly, the only option that made practical sense. The knock came on a Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from Meridian Freight, a long day, a productive one, the kind that leaves you tired in a way that feels earned. I had changed out of my work clothes and was making tea when I heard it. 3 knocks. Measured. Not urgent on the surface, but I had known Preston long enough to recognize controlled urgency when I heard it. I opened the door. He was standing on my doorstep in a jacket that was slightly too formal for a casual visit, which told me he had thought about what to wear. His hands were in his pockets. His jaw was set in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed a version of this moment several times and is now discovering that the rehearsal didn't quite prepare them. The confidence was gone. Not hidden gone. The particular ease he carried in every room. The assumption that he was welcome and that his presence added value. None of it was there. He looked at me and said, I need your help. 3 months ago, at the dinner table, he had said I wouldn't survive a week in the real world. I stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, I said. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. He had a folder with him, documents, financial summaries, a breakdown of the creditor situation. He had come prepared, which I respected even in this moment. Whatever else Preston was, he wasn't careless when something genuinely mattered to him. He laid it out plainly. Franklin's business needed the Meridian Freight creditor relationship to be managed cooperatively, a structured repayment arrangement, rather than the accelerated timeline the company's previous management had been moving toward. Without that, the pressure on Franklin's operation would become unmanageable within 60 days. Preston said he had tried other channels. that they had run out of options. That someone in his network had confirmed the new leadership at Meridian Freight was the key relationship to repair, and that the new leadership was someone he knew. He looked at me steadily when he said that last part. "I didn't know it was you," he said. "Not until 2 days ago." I wrapped both hands around my mug and said nothing. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I let the silence do what silence does when the power in a room has completely changed hands. I told him the truth. All of it, calmly, without drama, in the same straightforward way I would have explained a business situation to anyone sitting across that table. I told him about the call from Kwame 3 months ago, about the state Meridian Freight had been in when I arrived and what it had taken to stabilize it, about the creditor list I had reviewed in Ms. Okonkwo's office and the moment I had seen Franklin's company name on it. I told him I had said nothing then because my professional responsibilities didn't require me to, and because I had needed time to think clearly about what the right approach was. Preston listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then the color shifted in his face, not dramatically, but visibly. The kind of pallor that comes when someone is processing the full weight of what they are hearing. He had come here believing he was asking a favor from someone below him. He was only now understanding completely that the arrangement was the other way around. Franklin arrived 40 minutes later. I hadn't known Preston had called him. But when the second knock came and I opened the door, there he was, overcoat on, expression arranged into something between authority and restraint, clearly prepared to manage the situation the way he always managed situations. He stepped inside and looked around my apartment with the brief assessing glance of someone who had expected to find something smaller and less ordered than what they found. Preston said quietly, "She knows, Dad." "About all of it." Franklin looked at me. I gestured toward the table and sat back down. After a moment, he sat too. I walked him through the same explanation I had given Preston. The consulting work, the stabilization, the creditor list, the connection. I spoke the same way. Calm, factual without heat. Franklin listened. The particular armor he had worn every time I had been in a room with him for 9 years, the easy authority, the comfortable assumption of superiority, was not there. For the first time at a table with Franklin, the silence that followed was entirely mine. I laid out my conditions clearly. Not as demands delivered with satisfaction. I was not interested in the performance of winning. I stated them the way I would state the terms of any professional arrangement, plainly, specifically, without leaving room for reinterpretation later. First, I would work with Ms. Okonkwo to structure a cooperative repayment arrangement between Meridian Freight and Franklin's company. The terms would be fair and documented properly. Nothing that compromised Meridian Freight's own financial health, but nothing punitive either. Second, Franklin would acknowledge, to my mother and to anyone else in the family who had been present at the dinner 3 months ago, that the characterization of me he had offered that evening was wrong. Not in a public spectacle. Just clearly, directly, and without qualification. Third, and this was the one I stated last and most carefully, he would stop. The comparisons, the diminishments, the careful ongoing construction of Preston as the measure against which I was always found lacking. It was done. Franklin looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. He said it quietly. Not with the table full of people and glasses raised. Not with an audience to perform for. Just the 3 of us in my kitchen. The evening traffic faint outside the window. The tea long cold in my mug. I was wrong about you. Franklin was not a man who said things like that. I had 9 years of evidence for that fact. The words clearly cost him something. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the careful stillness of his hands on the table. But he said them. Preston was looking at the table. I glanced at him and saw something in his expression I hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something quieter. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like a person seeing a picture they had been told described one thing and finally understanding it described something else entirely. I didn't celebrate the moment. It wasn't a celebration. It was simply the truth, finally, taking up the space it had always deserved. The arrangement with Meridian Freight was formalized over the following 2 weeks. Ms. Okonkwo reviewed the terms carefully and approved them. The repayment structure gave Franklin's business the breathing room it needed without compromising Meridian Freight's recovery. It was clean, fair, and handled entirely through proper channels. Franklin's business stabilized. Clement and the operations staff got the clear plan they had been asking for. The immediate crisis passed. I continued in my leadership role at Meridian Freight. The work was still demanding and still mine in a way that felt real and solid and built on an actual foundation. At the next Sunday dinner, the first one after everything had settled, Franklin said something to my mother about my work that was straightforward and accurate and entirely without condescension. It was a small moment. Nobody at the table treated it as significant. I treated it as exactly what it was, a beginning, not an ending. As I was leaving that evening, Preston stopped me at the door. He said, "Thank you." "I mean that." I nodded. I believed him. Franklin stood behind him, coat in hand, and said nothing. But he looked at me, clearly, directly, without the familiar armor, and for the first time in 9 years, what I saw in his face was the one thing I had never once seen there before. Genuine respect. I walked to my car, drove home, and made tea in the quiet of my own apartment. I hadn't needed his respect to build what I built. But I was glad, finally, that he could see it.